you describe what you do right now?
What I do right now, and I really don't make any gestures which are that I instigate. I respond to situations the way I'm responding to a question. The thing has relevance only in terms of the fact that it is in response to a specific situation. It's not capable of being moved from that situation to another situation without being really altered by the change of condition. So therefore it counters the whole idea that art is a transcending power of some sort, that it can transcend time and culture and so on and so forth. The situations are what happens is a museum will ask me to come and spend some time in their situation, maybe do something. I go there, maybe spend a day, a week, or a month, or a year, trying to catch a feel of what goes on in that particular place. And I try and do something with that situation, leave as little trace of my own hand, as little identification of art as an actual singular event, and really, in a sense, try to alter how you perceive that situation in terms of reintroducing information which has previously been excluded. For example, you take the idea of an empty room. It means empty of something, the empty of some kind of meaning or some kind of metaphorical relationship. The idea that we bring something in the room and we come then to specifically deal with that. And if that's not there, then the room is empty. But actually, on a perceptual level, that's not true. The room is full. If you were to take the number of elements or relationships that exist in the room and put them into a familiar metaphor, like a painting, you'd have a very complicated situation. And yet we've managed to, through a system of intellect, through a system of concepts on a hierarchical value structure, to decide that certain things are valuable and certain things are meaningless. And the incidental things then become edited out of our vision and edited out of our activities, and finally edited out of all of our institutions and all of our planning structures and things of that sort. So one of the reasons I think that contemporary art has gone through all the changes it has is to reintroduce all that information.
Okay.
What does it feel like to affect someone's life with something you've made or said?
That's never a consideration. I think that's one of the biggest misnomers in surrounded art, especially in terms of as art has become closer to the act of, defined as an act of expression in a way. That when you say expression, I'll carry it to that in a moment. So it's no longer a question. The second misnomer is the idea that communication is really a root reason for art, and that's just not true. Communication may be one of the results of it, and there is, in a sense, a communication on the level of eminence, which is simply the fact that there are certain things thinkable and people are thinking them, and communication compounded by the idea of intention. In other words, I intend to communicate, I want to affect you, I want to control your life, I want to say something to you, I want you to respond to me. There's that communication, which is communication intention. The thing about art that is unique to it is that it takes up a perspective which is only in terms of inquiry and not in terms of effect or direct, like causal, effect in the world. What art does, in a sense, when you say communication, you have to make two compounds. You have to ask the word what and to whom. When you say what, you're assuming in a way that I already know something meaningful, in a sense, worthwhile communicating. You've already defined an act of understanding, which is like extremely complex, which has preceded this thing of communication. Then you add the thing of to whom. If to whom means to one intimate person who is very close to my own dialogue or very close to my own inquiry, then the metaphor for communication can be very intimate. If it's to be to a group of the size that I'm talking to right now, then the metaphor can be, let's say, has to be a little more specific, and it has to be a little more clarified. If it's, in a sense, to a very large segment of the culture, the way one would have to do if they wanted to make political effect or social effect, then the metaphor has to become a common metaphor, one essentially that already is in hand to some degree. So you realize that to whom finally begins to define the structure of for what. In other words, if you start taking that as a criteria, then you're going to change the answer dependent upon what it is you want to accomplish on the hand of that thing of effect. Questions which are temporarily, at least, probably do not have that direct causal connecting or that easy kind of assimilation or that kind of idea about a political idea about changing things or altering or being immediate in the culture. There are whole aspects of the art world which are involved with communication on different levels and in different ways, and there's no value judgment made here. as to the idea that it's more meaningful to play the game that I'm talking about, or more meaningful to play a game of communication. Value judgments are taken in the world, but I think they're misleading, and that by doing them, the fact that I am, or that I can think it, it's thinkable. If I'm thinking it, it's easy to assume that someone else is thinking it, at least somewhere. And so the basic requirement for communication is completed. That may sound like a confusing answer to some degree, but it's really critical. It's really important. If you make communication the reason for something, it's like cart before the horse. You restructure the act by in a sense, by a secondary demand. I don't know if that answers it.
Okay, this is an entirely different kind of question. And I know it's a hard question, but pretend for a moment that you aren't a quote artist, whatever that means. You're living another lifetime. What would you be able to do? Just the first thing that hits you.
Do the same thing I'm doing. I can't. I really don't act as an artist in the sense that I used to. In other words, not having a studio, and not having a formal act, and not moving in the world. I really am not very directly attached to certain aspects of the art world. I spend most of my time now doing research in ethnomethodology, and a great deal of my time with kind of building a phenomenology of perception. I'm also spending an awful lot of time. I worked with NASA doing research on habitability criteria for long-term space travel. I mean, how would one exist in an environment over long periods of time? What it would take to support it. I spend an awful lot of time doing a project called the Markestry Program, which is a system building. The idea that all structures and all institutions in this world are systems, and that they're really ultimately terrestrially conceived, that they're not extraterrestrially conceived, although they would like to approximate extraterrestrial singleness. But so I spend my time doing all those things, and it seems like there doesn't seem to be any singular definition.
Okay.
At this point in time, do you think museums relate to artists the way they should be?
It varies. Some museums do. It depends really on the personality. The museum as an institution per se started out purely, its relevance in the beginning, of course, was directly drawn from the assumption that there was an art, and it was they were essentially intended to be the same definition, same distinction. But a museum, like anything, is a compounding abstraction, which simply means that it begins to take on reasons and rationales of its own. The minute it has been around, or at the time that once it's been around, say for 50 years, it begins to have a history. It begins to have a history of acts which it has succeeded in doing. It begins to now have a history in terms of that art which it reflects. Given 100 years, that history starts to become, by some degrees, obscure, no longer directly relevant in terms of the culture now, in terms of a live art, but rather, in a sense, becomes a part of that historical precedent that we build our culture on. So now the museum has a educational responsibility. In other words, it compounds the assumption that it has to now have make some gesture towards clearing that obscurity up in terms of the older art. And as that becomes more and more complex, that educational responsibility becomes greater. So a museum starts to be a compound independently of art. And so you may even see it at some point in time when there has to be, say, a split, which is one of the things we're dealing with now, why museums are in such a difficult strait, in the sense that, and yet at the same time, their original election in the world was to be responsive to a live art. And the live art as it exists right now has become very contradictory in terms of all those previous orthodoxies, in other words, the previous structures that have been built. Art is essentially existing outside of those structures, forcing at least some people in the museum world to reconsider the idea of museum, what it means. It's possible that at some point in time we'll have to even see a direct split on them. It's very difficult for a institution, especially if it is culturally supported, to deal equitably with all those areas. I mean, it's a very complex thing to do. Some of them try. Some of them put their emphasis and energy.
Especially in young museums, is there an obligation to the artist or to that history of the public?
people assume obligations for museums depending on their perspectives. There is, I think, a legitimate demand made that a museum operate and make art, let's say, in a sense, available, free in a way, open, understandable to some degree. That's a nice idea. I mean, from an educational point of view, from a political point of view, that art is really available, that it's understandable, that it's, that in a sense belongs to everyone. I think it's a very nice idea. And art really, in a sense, I think in the hands of individuals in a certain periods, there becomes obscurity for obscurity's sake, but not in a sense, the difference between, let's say, the demand that art be relevant, the idea of the populist and the elitist view are really measures much more of effect. In other words, the use or misuse of an idea. What I'm talking about now has to do with, it's not elitist. There's a very big difference between the two. The only difference, the major difference is availability. Now, if you have a museum, which is willingly, now we have the other perspective, that a museum essentially pays attention to those activities which are paying attention to the periphery of our knowledge, that it in a sense supports or underwrites it, that it reinforces that act a little bit and makes all that information available, even though it may appear to be obscure given any particular criteria at this moment. So there's a very big difference between the two. The artist, of course, being involved with what he's involved with, tends to make a demand, a one-sided demand, that art respond, directly to art and to nothing else. But that's a little lopsided because there is no way of negating the assumption of history or the idea of history, which is obviously a very. But on the other hand, the critic, who is really now a dialectic materialist, which is simply the measure of effect, and not the measure of a quality of an idea, but the measure of its cultural effect, he demands that all things affect. And that idea of effect means simply A to B, like a causal sense. But like Jung said, Carl Jung, the psychologist, had a really interesting inquiry about that. They called it, he had to develop an idea of an acausal thought because we had assumed such a restricted idea of causal thought. So in thinking of this thing of acausal thought, he came up with what he called meaningful coincidences. And he pointed out in historical situations, all kinds of them. The idea that, say, 3 people will get the Nobel Prize simultaneously for a discovery, say, in subatomic physics, and yet they will exist in 3 parts of the world. One man will be in Japan. This has actually happened. One man will be in Japan and do it in a purely mathematical thing. The man Feynman that runs the physics department at Caltech arrived at his as a naturalist, some guy sitting on a rock scratching his head. And the third man was in Europe, and he came about it as a geophysicist. And you put the 3 together, they all arrived at the same answer at the same point. So what he's simply saying is that certain ideas are eminent in the world, and that they are not in.
Assuming that you can give museums distinct personalities, how would you characterize this museum?
How would I characterize this museum? It's split in 2. It's schizoid.
Would you say that
This museum is schizoid. It's split in 2. What you have here is a very old-fashioned, stodgy museum, not because of the fact that it's funded by the county, which one would think, but because it is, in a sense, is directed by a board which has almost no interest. In fact, should say, maybe 1 or 2 people. But other than, the great majority of the board doesn't even have any interest in the idea that there's a contemporary or a live art. They're only concerned with that nice and comfortable dead art, which doesn't move around or make noises or contradict. It has no ambiguities in it. It lays there and allows itself to be structured in a nice value hierarchical sense. The other part of the museum is the fact that there is a contemporary activity here, and that's really attributable to a personality. It's Maurice Tuckman. To the degree of good or bad that there's a contemporary activity in this museum, it's Tuckman. And it isn't just, you have to also take into consideration that he manages to do what he does without their assistance or approval, in fact, even against their grain.
Something I want to get into if we can in kind of a simple way, but I really like the concept. I asked you yesterday about a museum in the future, and you started talking about perhaps it being in people's minds.
You want to really get out into the periphery, huh? Yeah, the concept of a museum in the future is you can take the past as a kind of springboard to decide what might be happening, and you take the recent history of contemporary art, and the degree to which it is becoming less inclined to make solid objects, or to make things which are storable in that sense, or even things which have any degree of permanence. So the whole assumption of museums, as they're structured now, are to underwrite an idea of an art which is both contained and permanent. If art, as it is becoming, has less of a permanence, we're talking about a shift of emphasis from that idea of an external logic to a kind of an internal intuition, the difference and reason. And that, does that answer it?
Okay, now when do you think all people should be turned on to art?
Do I think all people should be turned on to art?
As say Ruth Bowman might feel in the education.
It sounds like a nice idea, and but at the same time, I think there's certain aspects of our consciousness, awareness, what have you, that can't really be administered, or they can't really, in a sense, be developed externally from you. It comes from an internal need in a way, and that really the need or the necessity to deal with the world in those terms is one that as it were, instigates itself in you. If you don't have that need, if it's not really interesting or important to you, I don't know why you should have it. I think in a pure abstraction, it would be nice if everybody did have it, like I say, but I don't think there's any reason why you should have it as such. And so the idea of arbitrarily educating everybody to some assumption of art, and you have to realize that the fact that it exists and resides in particular things is a cultural construct, but not necessarily so. The direction that contemporary art is going now very much is changing that context and broadening it out, so that to some degree, like I was saying about, you allow a certain idea about contemporary art to be real in your life, and so in our conversation, that's that whole system of education that we've set up, which is the idea of the assimilation of a kind of collective consciousness, is all underwritten by this idea of ideas as abstractions. And it really works in some way. And there's a great gain, but there's also a loss. It's a lot of contemporary art is about reintroducing the loss.
Okay. Yeah, do ask them.
Oh, do it.
Okay.
Okay, I will.
The magic number 11.
Okay. Say you have some people who, as you were talking about a little while ago, who do have a need to appreciate or a place in their lives for some kind of appreciation of art or art around them. Okay, you have those people, maybe you're a teacher at a school or something. Say you're given an unlimited amount of money.
If I were given an unlimited amount of money.
Yeah, to turn these people into art, these people who do have a need, what would you do? How would you choose?
First of all, I wouldn't need an unlimited amount of money. Money is not really much of a factor at all. Facilities are not really much of a factor at all.
Did you say I wouldn't need to turn people into art?
Oh, you mean me give the question? What was the question?
Turning people on to art.
Yeah, the idea of, let's say, of educating or turning people onto art. Again, you've made a metaphor there, which is an interesting one. Turning people on to art. It's like every time I start to get bored, we tend to like do something to entertain ourselves or to keep ourselves busy, which means that the minute we start to get bored, we pick up a telephone and call somebody, turn on a television set, pick up a book, go to school, become educated, any one of these things, see a friend and everything. The interesting thing about it is that every one of those gestures is out. It's out away from you in a way. And the idea of educating art, the idea in a sense that we have, is that the idea that there is an art and that everyone can be brought to that agreement, which really is essentially how our culture operates, the idea of common agreements. If there's a art, then everyone can be educated to that art. And even in educating other artists, that's what you do now. There's an old phrase, it's the Greek idea of education, which means to take that which is in and bring it out. What we really hold as education to a great degree now is taking that which is out and putting it in. It's just the reverse. And what I'm really talking about is going back more to that Greek idea.
Why did you decide to become an artist?
I mean, it's a simple kind of reinforcement. And I don't think there was anything really very interesting or very dramatic or very sophisticated in terms of how I started. I don't think that, I mean, I wonder if anyone ever starts in a sophisticated place. I think you start in the beginning, and you have these kind of very simple reinforcements, and you have these kind of simple abilities and skills, and what happens is that after a while, as you begin to become more and more involved in your activities, the questions get better, and your relationship to them gets stronger, and your skills become more complicated, but also your questions and your response to them becomes more intimate in a way, and even your I've forgotten the word, even your motivation. What's happening?
Go ahead.
Okay. Even your motivation becomes altered. In other words, the idea of why I was an artist in the beginning has absolutely nothing to do with why I'm an artist now. There's absolutely no similarity between the two. And I don't think you start at some place like where I am now. I don't think anyone does. I think everyone comes up through the ranks in a way, and it means simply that, and it doesn't make any difference what your original motivation is. In time, that something feeds back to you, you feed back to it, this dialogue develops, and not only does the thing change, but your motivations change, especially if you allow them free. One of the things, this maybe we won't need on film, but I got to say it at this point.
Rolling. Shoot it.
Okay, well, it's not worded exactly right. What should the attitude of a child be coming to the museum? If you were a teacher, how would you?
Really, finally, contemporary art is not that obscure. It's a fairly simple idea. In some sense, it's simpler than your classical art, because it's less of an abstraction, less of a learned logic, the way, say, verbalization is like learning another language. It's much more of an intuitive thing. It's something very natural in terms of your own physicalness in the world, and can be related to on that level. Everyone has the capability of understanding it. It's just a question of whether or not you want to give it a give it a chance in a way. And since it already exists, and since it has existed as long as it has, and the idea of docents in a museum, the idea of teachers leading them through and directing them and pointing out, is all related to that old idea of education that we talked about, and not related to the idea of what's going on in contemporary art. It makes sense to have a book, script, written text, docents, and so on and so forth when you deal with classical art. They're one and the same thing. They're the same structure and the art. They both mean the same thing, so they make good sense. And a museum can operate in those terms and equitably. But when you actually start to deal with contemporary art, one of the things you have in the museum has had to start doing, or has to start thinking about, is considering what the changes are and what it implies in terms of its relationship to things and to you and its place in the world. If you follow that through, one of the things you would eliminate is the docent program, because the old idea of explaining it externally through a logic has nothing to do with it. I mean, when Ad Reinhardt said,